Yeah, hi, this is Ashwin, and you're with me on the course Microsoft Azure Administrator. So, before we start off with the course, let me first introduce myself. I have over 15 years of experience around Microsoft infrastructure, Office 365, Microsoft Azure, AWS, and cybersecurity. And I'm passionate about developing the next generation cybersecurity solutions, working with organizations in adapting cloud into the operations, automation of operations, IT service management, and is highly interested in supporting organizations and individuals dedicated to similar goals. You can reach me on my LinkedIn URL. I've made a DNS forwarding on ashwinpro.com. All right, so what are you going to learn from this online course? I have tried to list out everything that you would be learning or will be able to do after successful completion of the course. Some of them will be managing Azure subscription or taking care of the alerts, basically reviewing Azure activity log, deploying resources with ARM templates. You'll be able to implement, manage, and secure storage. You'll be able to store data on Azure Content Delivery Network. You'll be able to build, execute, manage, and monitor virtual machines, and you'll be able to manage them using PowerShell. You'll be working with Azure DNS domains. We'll be dealing with site connectivity. We will integrate, secure, and manage identities with Azure Active Directory, self-service password resets, Azure AD Identity Protection, and other integrated SaaS applications. We will be able to migrate servers to Azure. We'll also work with implementing use cases and configuring options for Azure App Services and App Service environment. We'll try to manage and secure web applications with backups, restore snapshots, and cloning. We'll do a deployment of serverless computing features. Basically, we'll deal with Azure Functions, Event Grid, and Service Bus. You configure Azure Load Balancer, Traffic Manager, or Application Gateway. We use the Azure RBAC to grant a very granular level of access based on administrators' assigned task. We'll be able to utilize Azure's multi-factor authentication. And you will be also able to execute Azure AD privileged identity management to configure access rights based on just-in-time administration. Now, to take the complete advantage of this course, you should already have a good understanding on Windows Server administration and virtualization. Now, if you look into the Microsoft website, that is aka.ms/Azure Admin Learning, this is the learning path that you find for Azure Administrator, which means you should start off with learning Azure fundamentals. You should have an understanding on how to secure your cloud data. Then you manage the resources on Azure. At the end, you administer the infrastructure as well as the container. And that is what exactly we're going to cover up in these earlier mentioned agenda. Now, how is this course structured? We start off with the Azure fundamentals. In that, we basically talk about what is cloud computing. We talk about what is Microsoft Azure, and then we talk about managing Azure subscription and resources. We implement and manage storage. We deploy and manage virtual machines. We configure and manage virtual networks. And at the end, we talk about managing identities. So we'll start the Azure fundamentals by talking what is cloud computing. So when we talk about what is cloud computing, we first try to define cloud computing, and we can talk about the characteristics of cloud computing, Again, we can discuss about the advantage of using cloud computing. Then once we understand what it is, then we can get into the different models of cloud computing. Then we talk about how this cloud computing service came in picture. Then we talk about infrastructure versus platform versus the software as a service. Now, cloud computing in a general term is anything that involves delivering hosted services over the internet. Like say, for example, you're logging into your Gmail account. You're basically accessing a server that is hosted in the internet and that is hosted by Google. So you're actually basically accessing the cloud that is maintained by Google. Like if you access Outlook, same scenario, you're accessing a cloud that is maintained by Microsoft. Now, what's basically the major characteristics of cloud computing? Now, cloud computing, first thing that comes in mind is on-demand self-service. What does that mean? Cloud computing resources can be provisioned without a human interaction from the service provider. Except, for example, very simple scenario I can think about is, if you want to sign up for a particular mailbox on Gmail, you generally don't request for a mailbox, you basically sign up, right? That's a very basic understanding of a self-service scenario. Now, if you want to take it to the next level, in the cloud service scenario, you will be able to do self-service in a way that you can increase your storage space, you can add additional virtual machines, or if you want to add additional database and things like that. For everything, there will be a web-based self-service portal using which the customer can self-service certain functions. Now, the second thing is broad network access. Now, basically, these cloud computing resources are going to be available over the network and can be accessible by diverse customer platforms, right? So in other words, the cloud service is available over a network. Basically, ideally, it is a high bandwidth communication link, basically internet, or it could be, if it is a private cloud, it could be accessible over a local area network. Now, the third thing is multi-tenancy and resource pooling. Now, cloud computing resources are designed to support a multi-tenant model. But what is multi-tenant? Multi-tenancy allows multiple customers to share the same application or the same physical infrastructure while retaining the privacy and security over their information. If you want to look at it as an example, it's similar to people living in an apartment building. Basically, you're sharing the same building, but they will have their own apartments and privacy within that apartment infrastructure. Now, that's how cloud multi-tenancy works. Now, resource pooling means multiple customers are serviced from the same physical resources. That is, the provider's resource pool should be very large, or it should be flexible enough to service multiple client requirements. Now, this fourth characteristics of the cloud computing is rapid elasticity and scalability. One of the great things about cloud computing is ability to quickly provision resources in the cloud. And if you want to remove them, it's also as quick as possible. Now, this elasticity is a landmark of cloud computing, and it implies that any organization that is adapting cloud computing can rapidly provision and re-provision any of the cloud computing resources. And basically, when you want to scale, it has got a very less capital expenditure on the customer end. Now, when it comes to this scalability and elasticity, another term which we need to understand is just-in-time service. That basically means that these basically a requirement of the cloud elasticity, or requirement of the cloud service provider to provision more resources at certain amount of time, or maybe you need less resources at certain amount of time, but you need the resources exactly when you need them, right? So when you talk about the bottom line of this whole thing is, if a company needs to test something in the cloud, and they are paying for what they can use for, as long as, remember, to deprovision is, whatever, let's say, for example, as I mentioned, they are testing certain things. So they might provision, they might test is actually completed, they might only need it for 5 days. They could basically deprovision that, which means they no longer will be billed for any other day other than those testing days. And which basically comes to the fifth one, that is measured service. You can make sure that the cloud computing resource usage are metered, and you will have a clear understanding of a measurement of how much service is utilized by each of the customer or each of these applications. Now, what is the advantage of cloud computing? I think when you actually talked about the characteristics of cloud computing, you would have already got to know that. You basically have access to a broad range of managed services. You have minimized, or basically they may not be having any capital expenses. There is low operational expenses. And basically your billing is based on the usage, and you have better agility on your operations. Now, when it comes to the cloud computing model, there are 3 different cloud computing models. One is public cloud, private cloud, and the third one is basically hybrid. Now, in a public cloud deployment mode, the services which are deployed are open for public use, and generally public cloud services are free. Technically, there is a possibility there are paid public cloud services, but there could be possibilities that there are so many free public cloud services as well. Like, for example, I mentioned about Gmail. And if you talk about the public cloud, because that it is accessible by anyone from any location, there could be possibility of a risk factor involved in the same. Now, when you talk about private cloud, it's basically the same characteristics, but it is operated solely for a single organization. So you might have a higher cost involved because you have to take care of the infrastructure and everything, and it is only used by a single organization. But it still has all the characteristics of a cloud. Now, to take best advantage of this scenario, generally companies go with a hybrid scenario wherein you will have your identity service running from your private cloud, that is a cloud that is dedicated to you, and you will have certain services like email, like Office 365 and things like that on a public cloud. All right, so let's talk about the evolution of the cloud service first of all, like how these all came in picture. If you look at the beginning of the infrastructure administration, everything was a physical server. So if you need to actually install an Active Directory, there would be one domain controller installed on a physical system. Then if you want to install a mail server, then you install another physical server, and then you install Exchange and things like that. Now the next stage of that entire operations was introducing virtualization to the whole thing. That is when Microsoft introduced Hyper-V and System Center Suite. So now, instead of physical servers, it should be the same Active Directory server, the same mail server, but instead running on a multiple physical server, it would run from a single physical server. They basically create virtual machines inside of the same. Now, when the virtualization concept was becoming quite good, then that is when we started thinking about what if this server management is outsourced to a service provider. That is when we have something called infrastructure as a service, which means it's the same virtual server that you use to manage yourself, but now it is managed by a service provider. Now it basically matured to the stage that it actually started talking about platform as a service. Like a very simple example of that is a web hosting solution. Like, you generally don't own the server which hosts your website and things like that. They actually give you a platform and then you can upload your website there and things like that. Now it actually matured in a different way, and then it became basically nowadays it's generally a platform as a service, or else there will be software as a service, which basically very simple example of that is Office 365, wherein you take a particular software, that is Microsoft Exchange, as a service, and you host your mailbox and things like that. You need not have to worry about the server, how many servers are required to be managed and things like that. All you need to tell is, I need these many mailboxes, and you will be billed based on those. All right, so to give a better understanding on infrastructure as a service, or a platform as a service, or software as a service, if you look at the infrastructure as a service, when you need to look at, this is given by a service provider. In any service which actually involves a particular service to be provided, you need to have a data center or any physical location where you need to put the systems. There will be networking or firewalls or security requirements. There will be the actual server and the physical server and the physical software storage involved. And then you will have the operating system that you need to run on top of it. Then you will have certain tools, or you will have certain applications that you need to run on those operating system. When you take infrastructure as a service, there will be a service provider who is responsible for the data center, for the networking, firewall, or security, and they will be also responsible for the physical servers and the storage. Your organization will be responsible for maintaining the operating system, taking care of the tools, or taking care of the application for that matter. Now, when it comes to platform as a service, now in that scenario, the service provider is going to take care of your, again, physical server or physical location, networking, a firewall or security, the physical server or the physical storage requirement, also the operating system, also the tools that you need to manage these platform. You will be only responsible for basically the applications that you're hosting on top of that platform. Now, when it comes to software as a service, the entire ownership is on the service provider. So mostly you will find more and more companies moving towards software as a service, because that gives a lot of, the companies will have a lot more flexibility in doing their business. And the service provider who is specialized in these services will be taking care of the infrastructure for them. All right, so now you've got a fair amount of understanding on cloud computing. Let's talk about Microsoft Azure, and let's start with this. Like, what is Microsoft Azure? For that, I'll start off with an introduction towards Microsoft Azure. Then I will talk about the different services available in Microsoft Azure, and then I can, at the end of the day, talk about management of these Microsoft Azure. Now, Microsoft Azure is basically the cloud platform, just like Google's Google Cloud, or Amazon has got Amazon Web Services. This is actually a platform through which you can use Microsoft's resources. For example, if you want to set up a huge server, we will require a huge investment, huge efforts involved, and you need a physical space and so on. In such situation, basically Microsoft Azure comes to your rescue. It will provide us with all virtual machines. It will provide with fast processing of data, analytics, and monitoring tools, and so on, to make your work much simpler. Also, the pricing of the Azure is very simpler and cost effective. Basically, they have something called pay as you go model, which means they will only charge you for how much you use their infrastructure. Microsoft unveiled Windows Azure in the early October 2008, and it went on to live in February 2010. In 2014, Microsoft changed its name to Microsoft Azure. Basically, it was earlier called Windows Azure, and they moved it to Microsoft Azure. Initially, this Azure used to provide service platform for .NET services, SQL services, and many other Microsoft Live services. Now, if you look at the Microsoft Azure service, you can look at there are certain tools or portals available for security and management. There is specifically available for compute scenarios, basically the VMs or the remote apps that you need to run on the system. There is web and mobile service. There is development services. And there is basically a hybrid operations, which means it actually connects to your on-premise servers. And in the infrastructure services, you have compute, storage, and networking. Basically, compute is where you have the actual virtual machine in the infrastructure scenario. In the compute scenario of platform, you have remote application. The actual virtual machine will be in the infrastructure as a service scenarios. And in the storage is basically you have the database or the Azure files or maybe any premium storage that you have used. In the networking, you have like the load balancer, the DNS, you have the virtual network and VPN gateways and application gateways and things like that. Microsoft has got data center in 24 regions and it keeps increasing. Maybe if you look into the Microsoft side, you will find that new regions getting added very frequently. So when it comes to the Azure management, these are the 6 different things that one has to do on top of Azure. So if you look at monitor is basically something that the current infrastructure guys should be very much aware of. Basically, it's active collecting and analyzing data to audit the performance, health, and availability of your service, right? So an effective monitoring strategy will help you understand the operations of the components, and also it will help you to increase your uptime. Now, when you talk about the configuration, this is something that your organization should be already doing. That is, configuration refers to any initial deployment or configuration of resource, or it could be an ongoing maintenance activity that you want to do. Or it could be possible that you are trying to do certain automation of the task. And basically, if there is any redundant task in the organization, you generally try to automate the same. And things like that in the configuration. And the governance point of view, this is also something that you should be already doing currently. That is, you basically provide certain mechanism or policies onto your infrastructure so that your systems are working based on certain compliance requirement. Now, if you look into the migrate section, that's basically something that you will come into picture the very first time when you're moving to Azure. You will have to migrate your on-premise workload onto the Azure. So you should definitely have certain strategies involved in actually doing the migration. And in the secure portion is, once the data is in the Microsoft Cloud, you need to ensure that there is security management and threat protection in place so that your data is secure. And on the protect side, just like how you take backups of your data on your on-premise scenario, you basically need to ensure that you're taking backups of your servers or backups of your configuration, or basically you should be ready for any disaster recovery scenario. All right, so when you want to manage Microsoft Azure, you generally use the Microsoft Azure management portal, that is portal.azure.com. And this is exactly what we will be using a lot while working with these particular Azure servers. And this is a portal that you will use a lot while working or while learning this particular material. So what is coming up in this particular course? That is, in this course, you will be learning to manage Azure subscription and resources. You'll be implementing and managing Azure storage. We talk about how to deploy and manage virtual machines. Then we talk about configuring and managing virtual networks. And then we basically talk about managing the identity. Now, so if you are interested in learning this further, you can fill up the form that is there in the description of this LinkedIn post. And or if you're on YouTube, you will find it in the YouTube description. You can fill in that information, or else you can reach to me on LinkedIn. The URL that can take you to my LinkedIn is ashwinpro.com. And thank you very much for your time. We'll see you in the next session.